So, from the diaspora, we're going to talk about one of your favorite topics, constitution.
Oh well, you should have
Yes.
told me. I mean, I would have brought the Gambia in Transition book as a
I
plug. But
know,
anyway,
yeah, I would have, we
pop it
would
up.
have popped it up.
Open
You know what
access.
we'll do? We'll get a picture, and then
Yes,
I
open
will show
access.
it
Open
on
access,
the
please.
video.
And there might be plans for a second volume, but who knows? I'll say.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
We're coming very close to elections.
Yeah.
2025, 2026, and seems like the time is fading away, and this is where I'm gonna come. My question is,
Okay.
considering that it's generally accepted that 6 months before an elections, the laws have to be pretty much fixed,
Right.
and I think that's an ECOWAS protocol, as well as our constitution demands that the IEC will need 6 months, or has 6 months. They can do it earlier, but yeah, they have 6 months to conduct a referendum for a constitution. That in total is almost a year. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, what's at this rate? Can you see a constitution before the next presidential election,
And the presidential election is
2026
December. I mean, we, kind of, if you see, going back going by the estimate of the 1 year, what month are we in? April.
Yes.
I mean, we technically might, right? I mean, I'm trying to do an estimate, right?
Is that a hopeful, or is that a realistic?
I don't know. I mean, there is still time, right? Because I mean, if the bill is not withdrawn, right? Quote unquote,
It's
right?
not withdrawn.
Yes.
It's expected to come back at the
Exactly.
next, yeah.
Which I also think it's
Other
important,
recession.
right? Because part of the pushback, especially with the media, is which is fine because but the way that things are framed, right? And we do know that the everyday Gambian, right, obviously is not familiar with some of these terms, right? So people, in the way that the media frame it, or at least some certain media folks frame it, it looked like it was withdrawn, right? So I think being mindful as well. I think
Yes.
that's even part of the process, right?
Yes.
The part of the process in terms of engaging board with regard to policymakers.
Yes. Just to
as well.
make it, so what she's talking about is the fact that the constitution is actually not withdrawn. And in some areas, some quarters, the way it was reported in some of the media, obviously it seems as if it's actually been
Yeah.
removed.
By
But
government,
it will
yeah.
come in the second ordinary session. It's just that the second ordinary session agenda is not out yet, so nobody can say
Right.
what day it's been rescheduled to. So, but please do come in. So I think it's just an opportunity for us to educate the people who may be a little bit confused
Right.
based on the different conflicting news reports. But please do go ahead.
Yeah, no,
yes.
yeah, and I mean, on the, as you rightly said, both in terms of ECOWAS standards, but also, with the African Charter on Democracy and other regional and international norms, right? The whole idea that things are supposed to be in place to ensure smooth transition, but also ensuring free and fair elections, right? That, in that sense. So I mean, yes, I mean, as you know, obviously, I'm one of the biggest champion of the constitutional replacement project, right? And quite disappointed that fell through back in 2020, but also now that the process back on again, and I recently did the constitutional report that I usually do every year, right? And there I engage with both in terms of the constitution replacement project and potentially a new constitution coming back on the table, but also obviously, and we didn't. I mean, there's been enough conversation around that, but obviously part of some of the shortcomings and the criticisms around that, right? But I do think in terms of timing, I think ideally. I think it's still possible, but we're obviously running out of time, right? Which is valid. And I mean, both in terms of the promises and the vision of a new Gambia, right? Obviously, did call for a new constitution even before the 2021 elections, right? And now the 2026 elections. I think it's both in terms of disappointing, right? But also obviously to echo the calls, right? That it is vital that we do have a constitutional framework, right? That both speaks to the ideas and the vision of what we want New Gambia to be, right? But obviously addressing the numerous, more than 50 something times amended provisions in the 1997 constitution, right? In terms of ensuring that the Gambia is on a path, obviously, from authoritarianism to democracy.
So, like you said, the constitution is the bedrock of the that holds everything
Right.
together. Basically, I mean, if the Elections Act or bill was supposed to sort of, sort of feed into the whole,
Right.
constitution, and all these other reforms you've mentioned, the criminal procedures, and all of those ones which have been sort of taking a little bit more speed coming up forward.
Right.
But just looking at how parliamentarians are progressing the elections bill, they went through 34 clauses in the first ordinary session. So they're currently around clause 34 for the elections bill. That one even might, considering at this rate, there's over 100 and something clauses. So in that elections bill, which means that except they start going very, very fast, there might not even be an elections bill before the next presidential election. So I mean, considering the pace that the parliamentarians are going, um, just to sort of like, maybe, do you think that? Well, if I could reframe my question, what needs to be done now, in your perspective, for us to make sure that a constitution comes back in place? As somebody
Right.
who's got
Right.
this overarching, I want to take it
I
away
don't know
from
whether
the
I have
from
a
the, from
solution.
the yes. What needs to be done now? What can we do as a country to make sure that a constitution, and not just a constitution, because what the constitution is for is to set up the background, the
Right.
binder for the reform, right? What do you think needs to be done for us to have this constitution?
Yeah, I mean, and just in the question, well, it wasn't a question, but on the observation about the pace of the National Assembly in terms of reviewing laws, I mean, to say obviously as a legal scholar, right, part of obviously what we do ask of our legislators, right, is that they engage with whatever comes before them, right, in a way that is intentional, in a way that's comprehensive, as well as ensuring that the whatever bills and laws are in front of them, right, they eventually are in line or aligns with the constitution, but also the values and the norms that we as a country hold, including being part of the international community, right? So I mean, I wouldn't fault them to say that they're slow in terms of that, and I mean that comes from obviously my own background in terms of the work that I do and my training, but also I think there is also there an opportunity, right? An opportunity to say that when certain laws and policies are put in place, right, or placed before, policymakers, whether that's the National Assembly as well as other state institutions and actors, right, that there are also, I mean, I don't like the term experts, right, because I think it's problematic.
You're an
But,
expert.
right, but there are experts, say, for instance, subject matter experts or others that have knowledge both in terms of their training, in terms of their work, right, to say these are opportunities that these subject matter experts, right, can engage with Parliament in terms of supporting the process, right? It's not really because our subject matter experts is not in our place per se to make the final decision, because that's not
Of
in our
course,
power,
not
right?
only
But
to advise.
exactly, but what we can perhaps what the Parliament can do in terms of thinking about engaging subject matter experts, right, is really on this idea of them then being able to support in terms of both contributing and sharing the information, as we try to do obviously with the election bill, but also because I do think external support will then move the pace a little bit faster, probably, right? So that is an opportunity there in terms of thinking about that. I think both in relation, and that also brings me to the point, to the question, right, about what next should we be doing, right, or thinking about, right?
And just to help you,
Yeah.
perhaps you could consider executive, National Assembly. I know you've touched National Assembly, which is good.
Sure.
Civil society, just to give it a little bit of
Yeah.
flavor before it looks like we're just going for a government. Like, everybody has a stake to play.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, for people that know me and know my work, right, obviously I have been a proponent of this idea that, in terms of rebuilding our country, in terms of rebuilding the democracy and rebuilding the culture of human rights, rule of law, good governance, right, that it takes all stakeholders and actors within the country, right, whether that's government in this instance, obviously talking about the executive, the judiciary, which obviously, is my first, well, I don't know, first or second or third love, anyway. But and I, as we were having that conversation outside of this interview, right, that I grew up in the civil society space, right, and I do believe in the power of civil society actors as well, and to shout out, I mean, obviously from even before the transition in 2016, and with all the processes that have been ongoing, right, we see the sort of the resurgence of an active and vibrant civil society, right. Obviously, we know that during the German regime, this was, um, targeted in that sense, including obviously the media, as well as other actors as well. I mean, civil society have been doing great in terms of engagement. I think part of really also thinking about, even as we, as we think about a different approach or what's next, right? Both in terms of also being more strategic in terms of how do we sort of share civil society positions, civil society engagement, right? That is more consolidated, right? I mean, and this is nothing new. I've said this before, and that's not just civil society. In Gambia, we do double efforts or triple or quadruple or whatever, right? And there also lies the problem as well, right? Because there is really power in collective action rather than just individual and siloed ways of how we usually, right, do things as well. So I think, civil society in terms of, and as I said, they've been doing really well in terms of, I mean, we saw the national conference, right, that was held before, but also independent institutions like the National Human Rights Commission have taken, leading role, right, in terms of engaging and even having their own position paper or something like that, right. So I do think more consolidated efforts and more collective actions in terms of the call to government to ensure that we do have a constitution replacement project as well. I mean, part of that as well is especially with regard to dealing with the contested issues, right, or the contentious issues, right. We know that was partly the reason why the 2021 didn't work, right. While there is a possibility that, the question around whether it is even a possibility in 2025, right, brings us to that question. So I do think part of that as well, especially in terms of coming towards a political consensus. Obviously, we do have both, national level institutions as well as international partners, right, supporting that sort of endeavor where, especially political parties, right, that have a major role to play. I mean, we all can make, but we're not in parliament, right? And that means also that, I mean, that's a plug as well to tell young people that we actually do need to be in parliament as well. Anyway, but that's not me. Anyway, but yes, but I do think part of, the different stakeholders in our call, right, should really be to the political parties, right? And, whether in, the ruling party as well as other opposition parties that obviously are the ones that are going to make the ultimate decision in parliament, right? Is to say, this is not about political interest, right? I know that's easy to say, on camera and to politicians, because obviously politicians are there, right, to further the interest of their parties, right, and
their constituencies
and their agenda, right.
Yes,
and
yes.
in that sense, right. But I also think part of what we should be perhaps transcending to, right, is to go back to the call for a new Gambia, right. That's not really around political division, around political party affiliations and interests, right, and agenda, right, but that it is for the benefit of Gambians, right, of Gambians, and what we envision in terms of kicking out a dictator that was there over 22 years, uh, an extremely unique opportunity to showcase not just to the Gambian people, and to the African continent, but also globally, right? That despite that checkered history, right, that there is so much opportunity, right, that we can be sort of like I know this is cheesy, right, but a shining light, right, to this idea that we can consolidate democracy and build constitutional endurance in that sense, right. So I mean, this is also a core, right. I do think that especially stakeholders that are at the forefront of what the contentious decisions are, and issues are rather, and the ones that are to make the decision around whether we have a constitution or not, should really center Gambian needs, Gambian visions. I know there is, the pushback will be, oh yeah, but some of the critiques that we're saying are regard to Gambian Gambian needs and Gambians' interests, right? In that sense. But I do think here is an opportunity to come together, because I think what we, my editors and I, Adam Abebe and Gay So, in the concluding chapter, right, of the Gambia in transition towards a constitutional order, and I hope we get there, right, towards a new is the key word, right, is that constitutions are not perfect, right? There is no country in the world that has a perfect constitution, right? And I do think that should be the starting point, right? In terms of coming together and having and negotiating, obviously, within a genuinely engaged process, right? Deliberative process, right? That gets us to consensus, right, on a new constitution and getting in place. And then I think for me, obviously a new constitution obviously is great, right? But I do think what that also means that it doesn't have to be quote unquote perfect in a sense where, because the question about constitutions as their sort of the framework, right, of how the countries should be governed, right? If we do agree on certain frameworks that leads us to a new constitution, then we do have then the opportunity to implement the constitution, right? Because that has always been, I mean, within the Gambian context and beyond, that has always been problematic.
Yep.
We do have nice laws, right?
Yep,
Implementation is always problematic, right? But I do think it's coming to this consensus that we do not need a perfect document. What we obviously do need is that we as a state, and that's what liberalism is about, right? That democracy is about, right? That we do have agreed consensus on certain things about what makes us as a constitutional state, one that centers the needs of citizens and the visions and the aspirations of citizens, and for us to be a democratic state, right? In that sense, and also ensuring that democracy is consolidated, because I do think it's not just about us transitioning into democracy, but how do we ensure that the democracy is consolidated, but also then constitutional endurance then comes in as well. And I mean, yeah, I'm gonna stop.
Thank you.
I don't know.
You were worried
Yeah.
at the beginning what were you going to talk about. You see, if I had told you what I was going to talk about even more, then imagine how long I would be here.
Yeah, it was
But I'm so grateful for you. You're also, just so that people know, Satang is one of our supporters. So people who appreciate these kind of conversations, dialogue that sort of takes the issue a little bit further, not just talking about, individuals and this, that, this, that, but rather about the ideas. Please always tune on Askanwi and make sure you check out what Dr. Satang Nabaneh is always putting out there. We're looking forward to more of your research.
Sure, I mean, I
to
try.
be coming
I
out,
mean,
hopefully.
that's my, I do think that's my contribution in very small ways
Yes.
to, the whole idea around how we contribute as Gambians, whether we're in country or not. And I mean, people see me more in the country than out, right? But I think there is, there's a value there to think about, as you were saying, in terms of both, and that is very much premised on my own interest and what I believe in terms of what will take us forward as Gambians, right? A new constitution, but also obviously ensuring that the diaspora, Gambians in the diaspora who are equally Gambians as those in
What's
country,
your message to
are able to.
parliamentarians? Why don't let's? I think that's the best way to sign out.
I
Sign out with a
mean,
message to the parliamentarians because they have the power to get this elections bill
right.
and put diaspora in. They have the power to get a progressive constitution as well. If the power is all in their hands right now, before it comes to us for literal.
Yeah,
What's your message to
I mean, to the, to our honorable parliamentarians, of the National Assembly, as part of the diaspora now, speak as part of the diaspora, we do call on you, in terms of ensuring that our constitutional right, to vote, to be part of what we call the liberal order, right? In terms of choosing who leads us, you have the power, you have the responsibility, to ensure that Gambians in the diaspora are not excluded in that process. And I'm sure, and I've engaged with a lot of the honorable members, that I'm sure that that they will heed to our call, in terms of ensuring that our constitutional rights are enshrined and realized. Thank you.